So thank you very much, Dalit, for agreeing to this interview. We are very excited to have you as one of our first presentations within our Scholars Corner. And out of your various fields of research, especially the prophets and theology and ideology of the exile, today we would like to focus on your new project about the nature imagery within the Bible. So actually I would like to start with the previous and maybe current state of affairs in research concerning this issue. When you look back at the history of research, what role did nature imagery of the Bible play?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me in this corner, research corner, which is exciting, and for the opportunity to speak about this topic. Interest in the land of Israel, in the landscape or issues of biology and nature in its very wide definition has been going on, if I can go back, as let's say the second half of the 19th century, if you'd like. And people were visiting the land of Israel and the Levant in general, looking for whatever can say more about the landscape, which is reflected in the Hebrew Bible. So interest is there. I think interest has grown in the recent years into being much more specified and even, I would say, careful or going into specific issues. But on the whole, I think that this is quite a less addressed issue in our interpretive work. And the thing that brought me to this project was the understanding that we as biblical scholars are, of course, experts, and we see our duty to be experts in many various fields, as the work with the biblical text is always multidisciplinary by definition, and we take all the advantages of studies in many different fields of research, bringing it into our reading of the biblical text. But there is one large arena which concerns the areas of nature and nature imagery, which is less addressed. And it is less addressed mainly because most of the biblical scholars do not have familiarity with the land of Israel, with the area of, let's say, the East Mediterranean regions. I mean, the actual knowledge of what does it look like? What is the climate? What is the landscape? What is the fauna and flora environments? This is something that many biblical scholars would feel that they don't have the knowledge, and they do not have the leads to get this knowledge. And so in many cases, scholars find themselves, and of course we are all on the same boat in this, we find ourselves in places that we actually do not quite understand the image or the metaphor, and we unfortunately at many points just skip over and do not give the very deep understanding and attention that it requires. And this is, of course, a loss. I mean, this is something that I would not think that any of us biblical scholars would agree just to simply not address in the depth way that we usually do our work. So the DNI-project was formed to supply the answers to that, to allow biblical scholars and students to get the very basic knowledge and the history of identification and the information we can get from material culture, and follow the reception history of to the point that we will be much more let's say confident in the way we address nature images in their context, because the beautiful thing is that every metaphor or image differs in its own way and in the service it does in the context. So this website is supposed to bring all this information to students and scholars. It really should be a professional tool in our toolbox.
Yeah, and could you maybe elaborate a little more about the approach and the structure of the project, and especially of the website?
Yeah, so there is a website now beginning to be opened, and it's a very long-term project. It is called DNI Bible. It's an open access platform, and every student and scholar are invited to use. The website is built as a dictionary by items of 5 different fields of nature, which are fauna, flora, landscape characterizations, water sources and climate systems. So we try in these 5 broad fields to cover almost all, I hope all, the items, and there are of course hundreds of items of references to nature in the Bible. The items are subcategorized by their biological definitions, and in each item is discussed on its own, and each item is discussed in 6 layers. So we start with the biblical data, looking at the distribution of this item in the Bible, looking at different aspects of this item in the Bible, which is always, this is one of the fascinating things, that you see that an item, whether it will be a bird or a plant or whatever, is never presented in the entire spectrum of what you and I would have liked to know about this item. It's always, of course, dependent on what biblical authors wanted to do with this specific item.
And it has a literary function within its literary context.
Yeah, so on the first layer, we're presenting the different parts, elements, and features that do occur in the Bible regarding this item. And we do make the distinctions between the, let's say, realistic presentation context versus different kinds of imagery context that the item is used. We're looking at pairs and constructions where the item appears with. And so all this biblical information is presented to the reader just to be oriented. According to the interest of the reader, he or she can find the interest in continuing reading. And when continuing reading, you would go to the second layer, which is the history of identification. And here we we present a table with the information of all the references of that specific item appearing in the Hebrew text, and then according to the languages in different versions and translations along the textual attestation of the Hebrew Bible, going up to modern translations. And this is an unbelievable service, I think, with this table, because you really can get all the information presented. And it's always fascinating, because you can get into 2 different, let's say, large results. One is that the table is going to be very boring. So it's going to be very boring when, for instance, you get olive, okay, zait, okay. There's a kind of a real tradition regarding the identification of it. And so you have all the different references of all the different translations that will lead you to the same plant. Now, while this is very boring, but this is really interesting in the matter that you can really see that there is a very ancient tradition of identification of that item.
And a very stable one
and
in this
stable.
case.
Yeah, so the boring part is actually a very profitable thing, because then we can, I hope, be assured that when we're speaking of an olive, it's the same olive tree that I can show you growing in many areas in Israel, and then it will be, of course, important and beneficial to the interpretive work that we can do with texts that show olives or that use olive in their context. So this is the boring part, but the more interesting part is when you get a table and there is such a disagreement among the different translations, from the very early translations up to the modern ones. And here you can really track, and this is kind of what we like as scholars to do, the exciting part of investigating the information. You can really look at the ways things were identified and on traditions of identification. And you can follow places that the Septuagint possibly had no real idea about the specific item, so they have different suggestions. And then you can see that the Vulgate was influenced by this or that suggestion, but the Vulgate already knows the Targum, the Aramaic Targum, and it takes it. And so there is, and even the Targums may reflect different traditions, and then you add the Syriac, and you have, and on the Hebrew text, you of course consider both the Masoretic or even Proto-Masoretic text together with the Samaritan text. So we really try to be very broad in the reflection of the biblical texts, and then go to the modern English translations from King James to the yeah, we added the King James and the New Jewish Publication Society and the NRSV to just go to the modern translations and see what were their understandings, where did they continue or discontinue earlier traditions. So it's really a service for scholars to then have this chart and be able to see where are current translations, where they are on the large history of identification along the period. So this is, and then it follows with a discussion presented by a biblical scholar that can evaluate the different suggestions. So this would be the second layer. The third layer brings in scholars from the different disciplines of biology according to the items. So if it's a bird, then ornithologist would write it, or if it's a plant, a biologist would write it. And this will be a discussion which is completely on that specific discipline, written by professionals in their field. So and the request from those professionals would be refer mainly to those parts and elements that are presented in the Bible.
Okay, so there is some kind of relation to the former layers, and it's not a monolithic block outside of it.
Yes, yes, and the biologist will address. I mean, he or she will give us a general information about the item, but with greater emphasis on the specific points that are presented in the Bible, and then add some other things with map, with pictures, so that we can really get the information. I should also say that every part that is written is accompanied with a bibliography. So as scholars we can always attend to the actual studies that would present it, and this is really, for biblical scholars, all those biological fields are almost unknown fields, so it's really, again, a service for scholars to get to this information. And so that would be the third layer. The fourth layer would be the exegetical studies. So every biblical scholar is invited to say, okay, now that I've read the first, the second, and the third layer, I'm able to now present short or longer, whatever whatever the scholar is ready to produce, an exegesis of a specific passage that uses this item in its context. And now that I have this information, I can really do the interpretation in a different way. I can see how the nature imagery is really providing me another in-depth way to look at the text.
And to understand the text.
And to understand it, yeah. So this would be the fourth layer. The fifth brings us to the material culture, all the information coming from archaeology, which is of course wide and can differ, so it can include information coming from excavations, archaeobotany, archaeozoology, and iconography. And again, experts in those fields are invited to join in and contribute their take for this specific item. And the sixth and final layer is the reception literature, which brings all the information that is beyond the Hebrew Bible. So it will include Second Temple literature, New Testament, Jewish and Christian interpretive traditions, up to every other issue that refers to this item, up to modernity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in terms of technological aspects, so it is an open access website, it's a dictionary for students, for scholars. So if a scholar would like to jump in as an author, how exactly would be the procedure?
Oh, that's a very good question, and I'm really inviting as many biblical scholars and archaeologists that are interested. If you know of a biologist, please tie us also in, because really this is a project of many. It's not a project of one person, and it's a long-term project. And the strength of the project would be if people will be interested in gathering in and contributing. The contributions can be short or longer, because working with a website, we are not limited by words. And I should say that every contribution is credited to the author. It's definitely not a Wikipedia. It's credited to the author. We have an agreement, a legal agreement, as we all know from other peer-reviewed journals. So there is an agreement. There is a guarantee that whatever a scholar contributes goes through an academic reading and editing as we are used to do, and then the publication is on the website. The author has the ability to revise it in of course, cooperation or in consultant with me as editor-in-chief. But I or any other scholar do not have the permission to go into whatever a scholar wrote and, God forbid, change it or transform it. So there is a guarantee that the piece a scholar wrote is safe, and this is what he or she are responsible for. So this is the way we're working. We are in the point that I am happy to invite scholars to join in and contribute on their field of expertise. That's the only requirement is that people will do a very professional work with the responsibility that we're now giving this option to students and scholars to learn on this item. Mm-hmm.
And this is a very, very interdisciplinary, very highly modern, long-term project. And during your time within this project, did you face some kind of particular challenges? What was maybe something where you say, well, we had to work through this?
Well, a lot. I mean, the project started with this idea, or with this understanding of mine that there is a lack. There is a great lack, and I think that we as scholars feel it, and the reactions that I get from colleagues is so looking forward to this project, because we all feel that we have here a lacuna in our work. So the necessity is there, and we feel it. The challenges came and are coming just together with the excitement of doing it, and they are all over. I mean, as I just described, history of identification, it is a huge challenge, and to work it through is really something that the only thing I can say is that we work through each of the items in separate, and we are looking for a more general ways to handle it, but I think that this is something for the years to come to bring us to better knowledge. Another issue is indeed in the interdisciplinary work. I don't think we are used, as also the other experts from the other fields, we are not that much used into working together. And so bringing a biologist to work with a biblical scholar on an item is something that deserves a lot of work and even sweat from both sides. And it's a very interesting thing. And this is, I mean, we're more accustomed now, and you are very much into that, of working with archaeologists. But even so, it's not, as you yourself, I'm sure, experience, it's not easy. So this is, of course, a challenge in the interdisciplinary work. Another challenge, which I was already acquainted to very quite early in the project, is that there is, I mean, even the title, Dictionary of Nature Imagery, would raise at least, you know, doubts on what is nature,
how we define nature,
and how do we define nature, and so this is a conceptual thing. So most of this area, or the challenge in this, is the need to identify and to actually define conceptual things like nature. What is, I mean, and we are all coming from Western thoughts on what is nature and how is nature formatted from, let's say, the Greco-Roman world and on to the Western thoughts, but what was and whether there were nature conceptions in the ancient Near East, in biblical literature, and in the, let's say, the Eastern arenas, and were they similar or different, and in what ways to our Greco-Roman and Western thoughts. So this is a topic that is already part of the discussion, and this has brought the DNI Bible to open up to even wider formats of discussion. And this is a collaboration that I'm doing with several other scholars, and it's really you know, venues that will develop over the coming years.
So I think the impact of this project for every student and scholar is quite clear. Do you have some kind of intention or plans to maybe put it on a broader, research-orientated international scale?
Yes, and very much so, and it's really now taking shape into several cooperations. So I'll mention some long-term cooperations that I've already constructed with. One of them is Professor Christian Frevel from Bochum. But the interesting thing is that the cooperation with Christian Frevel developed into indeed looking at those issues of nature, of conceptions of nature, which is of a great interest for Christian Frevel, and I'm happy to have that as part of the discussion and as a nice outcome of the working together. Another cooperation which is very interesting and I think will contribute a lot is a cooperation with the University of Freiburg, working who have the Bodo project on iconography. And so the cooperation with Professor Hans-Ulrich Stehmans is taking shape into working more specifically on the connection between the literary evidence on nature items and nature imagery that we have in the Bible, and the great collection that they have on iconography, and how is nature or nature items, how do they appear in iconography. This is something that is of great interest for the Freiburg people, and we're now working together on this. So this is a second venue. On the more, let's say, academic and quite short, or if you'd like, annual basis, there is now two cooperations that will occur in the SBL annual meeting in Denver, where we'll have sessions that are in cooperation with the DNI Bible Project. We have two cooperations with two of the sections in the SBL, looking for the annual meeting in Denver. And so we'll have cooperation or specific sessions over the DNI Bible Project. One of them is in the metaphor theory and the Hebrew Bible, and the other is in biblical Hebrew poetry, which I really look forward to it. The steering committees of the two sections were very excited in looking at nature images within the interests of the two sections, and this is something that I'm very much interested in, to allow scholars to raise again and look at those nature images in the Bible and the way they are discussed. And finally, what we just did in Boston in the last SBL annual meeting was to launch a monograph series with Bloomsbury, T&T Clark, which is called the DNI Bible Supplement Series. And this is a monograph series that will be in print and will allow scholars to present studies, full-scale studies, over different fields of nature and nature imagery. Just to give an example, I myself am writing a volume together with an ornithologist on birds of the Bible.
So do you see particular field of actions where we still have to move on in terms of nature imagery?
I think that there are a lot, but I think that the DNI Bible Project, the website working on this specific item, is at the core of this study. And what I hope that will happen is that over the years, as we gather the information and we get to the different 6 layers of discussion, the knowledge that we will accumulate will allow us to really open up further discussions. So the first benefit that I see is really, and the first essential point that I see to this project is really the interpretive one. This will enable us to be better interpreters of the text that we read. But it then grows up to much larger cultural arenas of discussion, working on issues of conceptions of nature, of cultural connections between the ancient worlds, on those interrelations and interrelations, on not only on the specific identifications, but on the use of nature in literature. How our nature images are used in different genres of literature. So these are really opening. It's a field that you can really think of many venues of study that will develop, and it really is very exciting.
So thank you very much, Dalit, for this interview and for this amazing project.
Thank you very much.